They say the human mind is designed to protect itself from things it cannot comprehend. It builds walls of logic, creates excuses. But when I woke up at 3:14 a.m., the walls didn't just crumble. They turned to ash. My name is Julian. I live a quiet life, or I did. I work as an archivist, someone who spends his days surrounded by the smell of old paper and the silence of the past. I've always liked silence, but the silence in my bedroom tonight was different. It was heavy. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, making every breath a battle. I didn't open my eyes immediately. I felt the cold first. A dry, biting chill that shouldn't have been there in the middle of a July heat wave. And then, there was the sound. Not a footstep, not a breath. It was a soft, rhythmic sliding sound, like silk being dragged across sandpaper. Slide, pause, slide. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I forced my eyes open, expecting to see the familiar shadows of my wardrobe or the curtain. Instead, I saw nothing. Or rather, I saw a darkness so absolute it felt like a hole in reality. Then the shadows moved. They weren't just in the room. They were the room. Dozens of them. Tall, impossibly thin figures standing at the foot of my bed, draped in what looked like tattered smoke. They had no faces, just smooth, matte surfaces where features should be. They didn't breathe. They just watched. I tried to scream, but my throat was a desert. I tried to move, but my limbs felt like they were encased in lead. Sleep paralysis? That's what the logical part of my brain whispered. It's just a dream, Julian. Your brain is awake, but your body is still asleep. Just wait it out. But the logic failed when one of them leaned forward. It didn't walk. It elongated. Its head came within inches of mine. I could smell it now, the scent of wet earth and copper. A metallic, sharp tang that bit at my nostrils. Its skin pulsed with a faint, oily light. Julian, it whispered. The voice didn't come from the air. It vibrated inside my skull, a resonant, grinding sound that felt like teeth on a chalkboard. Julian, the harvest is late. The other shadows began to move in a coordinated, predatory dance. They didn't attack. They circled. They began to touch things. My books, my lamp, the photo of my late mother on the nightstand. Everywhere they touched, the color drained away. My blue lamp turned a sickly, translucent gray. The photo flickered and faded until it was a blank piece of paper. They were eating the meaning of my life. I found the strength to gasp, a ragged, desperate sound. What do you want? The shadow leaning over me tilted its head. It felt like it was looking through my eyes and into the very core of my memories. We want the parts of you that you don't need anymore. The regrets, the grief, the things that make you heavy. It sounded like a mercy. It sounded like a cure for the depression that had dogged me for years. But there was a hunger in that voice. A cold, bottomless void that suggested they wouldn't stop at the bad things. Suddenly, the shadow reached out a long, spindly finger, touched my forehead. The world exploded in white noise. I saw my 7th birthday. My mother was handing me a cake. I felt the warmth of the candles, the sweetness of the icing. And then, I watched as the memory was sucked into the shadow's finger. The image blurred, turned black and white, and then vanished. I couldn't remember the cake anymore. I knew that it happened, but I couldn't feel it. The joy was gone. No! I finally managed to shout, the sound tearing through my throat. I lunged out of bed, collapsing onto the floor. The shadows recoiled, their smoke-like bodies flickering. I scrambled for the door, but the hallway was gone. My bedroom door opened into a vast, empty library, a twisted version of my workplace. The shelves went up for miles, filled not with books, but with glowing jars. I looked back. The shadows were flowing out of my bedroom like ink spilled on a white floor. The archive must be filled. The lead shadow resonated. You are the curator, Julian. You chose this. I never chose this. I screamed, running into the infinite library. The floor beneath me felt soft, like rotting paper. As I ran, I passed jars labeled with names I didn't recognize. Martha, First Kiss. David, Fear of Heights. Leo, Final Breath. I realized with a jolt of horror what this place was. This wasn't just a dream. This was where the world's emotions went to die. And the shadows were the harvesters. I ran until my lungs burned, until the blue light of the jars became a blur. I needed to find a way out, or I would become just another empty jar on a shelf. A man without a soul. A hollow shell walking the earth. I saw a flickering light in the distance. A door that looked like my front door. It was standing alone in the middle of a corridor of jars. I sprinted for it, the shadows hot on my heels, their whispers filling my mind with every failure I'd ever had. I reached the handle. It was freezing. I turned it and threw myself through. I woke up. I was back in my bed. The sun was streaming through the window. 10 a.m. I was drenched in sweat, my heart still racing. Just a nightmare? I whispered, clutching my chest. Just a vivid, terrifying nightmare. I sat up and reached for my phone. My hand brushed the photo of my mother on the nightstand. I looked at it. It was a blank piece of paper. I felt a coldness settle in my gut that no sun could warm. I looked around the room. My blue lamp was gray. My books on the shelf, the ones I had read 1,000 times, were empty. I wasn't awake. I had just moved to a different floor of the library. And then I heard it. From the corner of the room. Behind the wardrobe. Slide. Pause. Slide. The blank photo in my hand felt heavier than the world. It wasn't just paper. It was a wound where a person used to be. I looked at the bed where I had awakened. And the sheets were already graying, the fabric becoming brittle and translucent as if the very atoms were being harvested by the entities in the walls. Slide. Pause. Slide. The sound was coming from behind the mahogany wardrobe my grandfather had left me. That wardrobe was one of my few remaining anchors to a reality that made sense. I grabbed a heavy brass bookend, a solid, physical object, and stepped toward the corner. My breath came in shallow, jagged hitches. The air was so cold now that my exhaled breath didn't just mist. It hung in the air like frozen cobwebs. "Show yourself," I barked, my voice cracking. The wardrobe didn't just move. It groaned. The wood split down the center, not from force, but as if it were being unzipped from another dimension. From the dark fissure, a hand emerged. It wasn't the spindly, smoke-like limb of the shadows I had seen before. This was a hand of pale, sickly marble, with fingers that ended in sharp, obsidian points. It gripped the edge of the wood, and a figure pulled itself into my room. It was taller than the others, draped in a heavy, tattered cloak made of what looked like dried skin and ancient parchment. It had a face, sort of, a mask of white bone with 2 vertical slits for eyes that glowed with a faint, rhythmic green light. "Julian," the figure hissed. The sound was like 1,000 dead leaves skittering across a tombstone. "The curator is not supposed to leave the archive." "I am not a curator. I am a man," I screamed, swinging the brass bookend with everything I had. The metal passed right through the entity's head as if it were made of mist, but the momentum threw me off balance. I fell toward the wardrobe, toward the fissure. As I tumbled, the entity caught me. Its grip was like a vice of ice. It didn't throw me back. It pulled me in. The transition was instantaneous. The smell of my bedroom, dust and old laundry, was replaced by the overwhelming scent of ozone, burnt sugar, and the stagnant dampness of an ancient cellar. I wasn't in the library of jars anymore. I was in a place where the architecture defied gravity. I was standing on a walkway of black glass that stretched across a literal ocean of shadows. Above me, there was no sky, only a ceiling of inverted towers made of bone and flickering blue minerals. Thousands of the shadow figures moved between the towers, carrying glowing orbs that pulsed like hearts. "Welcome to the Great Regression," the masked figure said, releasing my arm. "This is where the universe stores the things it decides are too painful to keep in the light." I looked down into the ocean below. It wasn't water. It was a churning mass of human faces, thousands of them, eyes wide and mouths open in silent screams. These weren't just memories. They were the people who had been forgotten. "Why me?" I whispered, the cold of the walkway seeping through my socks. "I'm just an archivist." Exactly, the entity replied, its bone mask tilting. You have spent your life organizing the dead thoughts of others. You have a talent for order. The archive is overflowing, Julian. The surface, your world, is leaking. People are remembering too much. The grief is becoming a flood. We need someone to build new levees. The entity gestured to a massive structure ahead. It was a cathedral of shelves, but instead of books or jars, these shelves were filled with living, breathing hearts, each encased in a thin layer of translucent stone. Your brother, the entity said suddenly. I froze. I don't have a brother. The masked figure chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. Not anymore. He was the first harvest. You were 7. He fell into the pond, didn't he? You watched. You felt the cold. You felt the guilt. And then, you didn't. A memory flared in my mind, hot and agonizing. A small hand reaching out of dark water. A blue coat. A name, Arthur. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow, and then, as quickly as it came, it started to fade, the colors turning to that sickly gray. Give it back, I roared, lunging at the entity. That's mine. He was mine. It is a heavy burden, Julian. Wouldn't you rather be light? The entity raised its hand, and the obsidian claws began to glow. I felt a tugging sensation in my chest, right over my heart. Felt like a hook had snagged my very soul. I watched as a silvery thread began to pull out of my skin, coiling around the entity's fingers. With it came the feeling of Arthur's laughter, the smell of his hair, the weight of the secret I had kept for 30 years. I realized then that the archive wasn't a place of preservation. It was a place of consumption. These things fed on the energy released when a human soul was stripped of its history. I reached for the black crystal dagger I had seen in my dream, or perhaps it was a memory of a weapon I hadn't used yet. My hand closed around a shard of the walkway that had broken off. It was sharp, cold, and hummed with the same energy as the shadows. I won't let you erase him again, I hissed. I didn't swing at the entity's head this time. I stabbed the shard into the silvery thread connecting us. A shockwave of pure agony ripped through the walkway. The silvery thread shattered like glass, and the sound that erupted from the archive was the collective scream of a billion forgotten souls. The ocean of faces below began to boil. The masked entity recoiled, its green eyes flickering violently. You have broken the seal. The grief will consume everything. Good, I spat. Let it. I turned and ran back toward the wardrobe fissure, but the walkway was dissolving. The inverted towers above began to crumble, falling like massive teeth into the sea of faces. I saw the shadow figures screeching, their smoke bodies dissipating as the meaning they had stolen began to leak back into the void. I jumped. I didn't jump toward the door. I jumped into the ocean of faces. I expected to die, to be torn apart by the weight of a billion tragedies. Instead, I felt a strange warmth. As I sank into the shadows, I saw him, Arthur. He was a boy of 6, wearing his blue coat, suspended in the dark. He wasn't a memory. He was there. He reached out his hand, and this time, I grabbed it. The world turned white. I woke up. I was in a hospital bed. The lights were blindingly bright, and the smell of antiseptic was thick. A nurse was standing over me, her face a mask of professional concern. Mr. Vance? You're awake. You gave us a scare. Carbon monoxide leak in your apartment. Another hour and you wouldn't have made it. I tried to speak, but my throat was raw. I looked at my nightstand. There was a photo. It wasn't blank. It was me and a boy in a blue coat, standing by a pond. We were both smiling. Arthur, I croaked. The nurse paused, her brow furrowed. Who's Arthur, Julian? You live alone. We didn't find any records of a brother. I looked back at the photo. The boy in the blue coat was starting to fade. His face was becoming a blur of gray pixels. The sliding sound started again. Not from the hallway, from under my bed. Slide. Pause. Slide. The nurse's voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. Her face, though human, had that same rhythmic flickering behind the eyes. a green, electronic pulse that suggested the real world, was just another layer of the archive's skin. I stared at the photograph in my trembling hand. Arthur's face was almost gone now, replaced by a jagged, static-filled hole that seemed to suck the light out of the room. "You don't understand?" I whispered, my voice sounding like grinding stones. "The carbon monoxide. It wasn't a leak. It was a thinning. The barrier is gone." I looked toward the corner of the hospital room. The shadows there weren't staying put. They were stretching, detaching themselves from the floor and crawling up the legs of my bed like liquid ink. The slide. Slide. Sound was no longer a distant threat. It was a rhythmic heartbeat thumping against the underside of the mattress. "Mr. Vance, you need to lie back," the nurse said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming that dry, skittering sound of dead leaves. "The grief is too heavy for you. Let us take it. Let us make you light." She reached for the 4-line, but her fingers weren't flesh. They were the obsidian claws I had seen in the Great Regression. I ripped the needle from my arm, blood blooming across the white sheets like a dark flower. I scrambled out of the bed, my bare feet hitting the cold linoleum. Except it wasn't linoleum anymore. The floor was turning into that black glass walkway, and beneath it, the ocean of faces was rising. I sprinted for the door, but the hospital hallway didn't lead to a lobby. It stretched into an infinite corridor of mahogany wardrobes, each one splitting open to reveal a different version of my own life. Memories I didn't know I had lost. In one, I saw myself at a wedding I never attended. In another, I was holding a child I never fathered. The archive hadn't just taken Arthur. It had been harvesting my entire potential existence for decades. "You can't run from the sum of what you are, Julian." The voice boomed from the walls. It was the masked entity, now towering 20 feet tall, its tattered cloak of skin billowing in a wind that smelled of old libraries and rot. I stopped running. My lungs burned with the ozone air. I looked at the shard of black glass still clutched in my hand, the piece of the archive I had brought back with me. It was pulsing in time with my own heart. "I'm not running," I said, my voice steady for the first time. "I'm an archivist, and I know how to close a file." I realized the entity didn't want my memories because they were precious. It wanted them because they were unresolved. The leak was caused by the pressure of things left unsaid and pains left unfelt. The shadows were the physical manifestation of the things we bury instead of face. I turned to the wardrobe that held the memory of the pond. I saw the 6-year-old version of myself standing on the bank, paralyzed with terror as Arthur's hand slipped beneath the surface. For 30 years, I had let the shadows eat that moment so I wouldn't have to feel the guilt. "I see you, Arthur," I whispered. I didn't use the glass shard to attack the entity. I pressed it against my own chest, right over the silver thread that was still trying to leak out. I forced myself to feel every second of that day. The cold water, the sound of the splash, the silence that followed. I embraced the weight. I became the anchor. The effect was cataclysmic. The archive began to implode. Because I was no longer resisting the grief, the entities had nothing to harvest. They were parasites of denial, and I had just cut off their food supply. The masked entity shrieked, its bone mask cracking down the middle. "You will drown in it. No human can carry that much truth." "Then I'll drown," I said. "But I'll drown with him." The hospital, the glass walkway, and the bone towers shattered. The world dissolved into a cacophony of color and sound. Every memory the archive had ever stolen came rushing back at once. It was a tidal wave of every "I love you," every "I'm sorry," and every goodbye ever uttered by humanity. Then silence. I opened my eyes. I was lying on the grass by a pond. The sun was setting, casting a long golden glow over the water. It was a warm summer evening. I felt the dampness of the earth beneath me and the scratchy sensation of grass against my neck. "Julian." I turned my head. Arthur was sitting next to me. He wasn't a gray blur or a fading ghost. He was real. He was 10 years old, his knees scraped from climbing trees, his eyes bright and full of mischief. "You fell asleep," he laughed. "Come on. Mom's calling us for dinner." I reached out and touched his arm. He was warm. He was solid. I felt a sob catch in my throat. A real human sob of pure relief. "I'm coming," I said, standing up. My body felt heavy, but it was a good weight. The weight of a life actually lived. We walked toward the house on the hill, our shadows stretching out long behind us. But as I looked down, I noticed something. Arthur's shadow was normal. It followed his every move. My shadow, however, was different. It was still made of that thick, swirling smoke. And as I watched, it didn't stay attached to my feet. It paused. It slid. I looked back at the pond. The surface of the water was as still as a mirror. But deep beneath the surface, I could see thousands of glowing green eyes staring back up at me. The archive wasn't destroyed. I hadn't escaped. I had simply been promoted. The nurse's voice echoed in my head one last time, drifting from a world I would never see again. "He's gone. Time of death, 3:14 a.m. Cause, sudden respiratory failure. He looks peaceful, doesn't he?" I looked at Arthur, who was waving at me from the porch. I smiled and waved back, even as the green light in my eyes began to pulse in time with the shadows. "Slide," I whispered to the wind. "Pause. Slide."